The rain had long since stopped, but the scent of it lingered in the wood, that damp, swollen fragrance of rot and memory. Bellmere House stood on the edge of the moors, its chimneys leaning like old men in prayer, its windows dimmed by decades of neglect. I had not meant to return, yet there I was, standing at the threshold once more, my hand trembling upon the latch that had once closed against the sound of her voice. The house breathed still. You could feel it through the soles of your boots, a faint pulse beneath the floorboards, a rhythm like the memory of footsteps. The hall was lined with portraits that seemed to lean inward as I passed, their eyes dulled by dust, their expressions caught between grief and accusation. There was no warmth left in that place, only the residue of years that had refused to end. It was in that house that I learned how silence could wound more deeply than words. My father's death had left the estate in disarray, the servants gone, the chapel unblessed, the land untended. But it was my mother's absence, her slow vanishing into the upper rooms, that left the greater ruin. Some said grief took her. Others whispered that Bellmere itself consumed her, inch by inch, the way ivy consumes stone. I remember the way she used to sit by the tall window overlooking the gardens, where nothing grew any more but nettles and moss. Her reflection in the glass always seemed older than her years, as though the house had stolen her youth to preserve its own. She spoke rarely after my father's funeral, and when she did, her voice carried the chill of the cellar air. "We keep what we inherit," she once told me, whether it was meant for us or not. I did not understand her then. I was young, proud, eager to restore what had fallen apart. But restoration is a dangerous word. It implies resurrection, and the dead have no patience for being disturbed. Each time I mended a wall or scrubbed a window clean, something else in the house seemed to fade. A sound, a scent, a memory that no longer fit its corner. It was as if Bellmere resisted the touch of the living. By the time I was 30, the estate had become a mausoleum of habit. I woke to the same damp chill each morning, walked the same corridors, watched the same light die behind the same curtains. The villagers had stopped visiting, claiming the road was cursed after dusk. Even the postman left his letters at the gate, as if afraid that proximity itself might invite something into his home. I cannot say they were wrong. It was on a late autumn evening that the first sign came. I had gone to the drawing room to light the fire, though I scarcely felt the warmth any more. On the mantel stood the silver mirror my mother once prized, blackened now with tarnish. When I lifted the cloth to clean it, the reflection that met my eyes was not my own, not entirely. A face lingered behind me, faint as the outline left by smoke on a window pane, pale lips, a hollow gaze, and then it was gone. I remember sitting down, unable to breathe, unable to trust the stillness that followed. The house was silent, yet I could feel a tremor running through the air, as if the walls themselves were remembering something I had forgotten. That night I did not sleep. The moonlight crawled across the ceiling like a slow accusation. Somewhere above, in the old nursery, a single floorboard creaked, followed by another, then another, and a measured pacing, soft, deliberate. Impossible. I told myself it was the wind, the settling of wood, the tired echo of an empty house. But the steps paused and stayed, and though I dared not move, I knew exactly where they had stopped, directly above my room, and I swear to you, I could almost hear her breathing. I rose before dawn. Though the word rose feels dishonest, I merely gave up on sleep. The air had that hollow stillness that comes before rain, the kind that makes wood swell and the walls whisper. I walked the corridor barefoot, the floor cold as stone beneath me. The house seemed to wait, not with welcome, but with a kind of listening. When I reached the base of the staircase, I hesitated. The steps above remained dark, untouched by morning. It had been years since anyone climbed to the upper rooms. My mother had sealed them after my father's death. She said certain doors were meant to stay closed, that grief had its proper boundaries. Yet even after she vanished, I had obeyed that silence, as though her absence carried authority greater than her presence ever had. But that morning, something in me refused obedience. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps the face I'd seen in the mirror had unsettled something old in me, something long denied. I took the first step, and the wood groaned like an old throat clearing itself to speak. The second floor was colder. Dust hung in the air like fine ash, and the faint smell of lavender still clung to the walls. My mother's scent. It hit me with a sudden ache. Not grief, but guilt, that strange twin emotion that always follows it. I passed the nursery door, its porcelain handle still tied with a frayed ribbon. When I touched it, it crumbled in my hand. The room beyond had not seen daylight in decades. Inside, the curtains were drawn, but the outlines of furniture loomed in the dimness. A small cradle, a chair, a cracked mirror. And in the corner, a covered shape that might once have been a dollhouse. The kind with tiny wooden people frozen forever in their rooms, pretending to live. I do not know why I crossed the threshold. Perhaps some part of me believed I would find her there. My mother sitting in her old chair, still watching the garden where nothing grew. But the room offered no such mercy, only the slow drip of water from the ceiling and the faint tremor of my own breath. I remember touching the wallpaper. Beneath my fingers, the pattern of roses had turned to mold. The design was almost gone, but when I leaned closer, I saw something strange, the outlines of letters written beneath the paper. Small hurried strokes like a prayer or a warning. I peeled the damp edge away and found words faintly carved into the plaster beneath. We are never alone in inheritance. The handwriting was hers. I knew it as surely as I know the lines of my own palm. My knees went weak and I sank to the floor. The words felt alive, not merely read but heard. I whispered them aloud, and as I did, something shifted within the walls. A faint thud, distant, rhythmic, like footsteps echoing through the timbers, though none should have been there. I fled the room then, down the staircase and into the hall, gasping as though I had run a mile. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch in new alignment, their eyes dark with knowledge. I felt the urge to leave the house altogether, to step into the rain and walk until I found a road that led anywhere but back to Bellmere. But I did not, because when I reached the door I saw it, a single muddy footprint on the threshold, small, narrow, unmistakably feminine. And though my mother had been dead for 20 years, the mud was still wet. That night I could not keep the lamps lit. The air itself seemed to devour the flame, as if the darkness had grown hungry during the years of my absence. Each wick flickered, trembled, then died, leaving only the faint glow of the hearth. I sat beside it for hours, listening to the quiet, every sound magnified, the tick of the clock, the groan of the rafters, the distant scrape of branches against the shutters. I told myself the footprint must have been mine, that I had stepped in something damp from the garden without noticing. But the more I said it, the less I believed it. The print had been too narrow, too precise. I could still see it in my mind, delicate as lace, pressed into the threshold as though the house itself had marked her return. When I finally slept, I dreamt of the upper rooms, not as they were, but as they had been when I was a child. The nursery bright with morning light, my mother humming by the window, her pale hands busy with the mending. She turned toward me, smiling, but her mouth did not move with the song. The sound came from somewhere behind her, from within the walls. It was not humming at all. It was breathing. I woke with my hand clutching my chest, the sheet damp beneath me. The clock read 2:30. The house was silent again, but not empty. There is a kind of silence that feels alive, a listening silence. Bellmere had that silence now. I rose and lit another candle. The light barely reached the corners of the room. When I stepped into the corridor, the boards felt warm beneath my feet, as if someone had passed that way moments before. I followed the faint scent of lavender up the stairs, the candle's flame trembling with each step. I told myself I only wanted to be sure, to confirm that nothing had changed since the morning, but everything had. The nursery door was open. The ribbon I'd crushed in my hand was gone. The cradle had been moved, not by inches but by feet. Its small frame turned toward the wall, facing the corner like a child in punishment. The wallpaper I had torn away now hung loose in strips, the words beneath no longer faint. They seemed deeper, gouged into the plaster by something sharp. I could read them clearly in the flickering light. We are never alone in inheritance. We belong to what we keep. I could not breathe. The words pulsed in the lamplight like veins. I felt as though the house were whispering them, syllable by syllable, through the beams and walls. I stumbled backward, knocking over the candle. The flame caught the edge of the torn paper, and for a brief second I saw something beneath the writing, a darker stain that had seeped through from within the wall itself. I smothered the fire with my coat, the air filling with the smell of damp ash and mold. When I looked again, the words were gone, as though they had never been there. Only the faint scorch remained. I stood in that smoke, shaking until I heard it, a soft dragging sound above me. From the attic. I had not stepped into that place since my father's burial. My mother forbade it, saying it belonged to him still, that he hadn't quite finished his rest. But something moved there now, slow, deliberate, pacing the length of the boards. Back and forth, and then it stopped, directly above where I stood. I waited for another step, another sound, but none came. Only silence. The kind that makes your own pulse sound like thunder. I whispered her name then, not out of courage, but out of exhaustion. Mother. And from above came an answer, soft and hollow as if spoken through dust. My dear, you shouldn't have come back. For the rest of that night I sat on the bottom step of the staircase, candle long extinguished, waiting for dawn to find me. When light finally seeped through the cracks of the shutters, it revealed the dust that had gathered like snow across the hall, and in it the faint impression of bare feet leading downward from the attic door. I did not follow them, not then. I dressed and left the house without eating, walking into the village as the morning bells tolled from St. Aldwyn's chapel. The fog lay thick over the fields, turning the hedgerows into pale silhouettes. It had been years since anyone had looked me in the eye there. They knew my name, but they did not greet it. The Bellmere inheritance was a stain that never washed away. My father's debts, my mother's decline, my own cowardice. The vicar, Mr. Fenley, saw me before I reached the gate. His face hardened, though he tried to keep his tone soft. "You shouldn't have returned," he said. "The house remembers too much." "I don't believe houses remember," I told him. He smiled then, the kind of smile that carries no warmth. "You will?" I asked about the parish records, why my mother's burial. I wanted to know where they had laid her, though I already feared the answer. He led me inside, where the air smelled of wax and damp wood. The ledger was open, the ink brown with age. Under the year of her passing, her name was written not once but twice, first crossed out, then written again in a different hand. I asked who had amended it. The vicar would not say. He only closed the book and whispered, "She was not buried here, Mr. Bellmere. Your father forbade it." The world seemed to tilt slightly then, as if something deep within the earth had shifted. "Then where?" I asked. He only looked toward the road that led back to my estate. "Where she belonged," he murmured. I left the chapel before he could speak another word. The wind had risen, and the clouds pressed low, the color of old pewter. When I reached the house, the front door stood open, though I had locked it that morning. The trail of footprints in the dust was gone. The air had changed, heavier, thick with the scent of something sweet, rotting and floral. In the drawing room, the portrait of my mother lay face down on the floor. The glass had not shattered, but the frame had cracked clean through, right across her painted eyes. I lifted it carefully, turning it over. Her face stared back at me, unchanged, save for one detail I could not explain. The painter's signature at the corner, once faint, had darkened, spreading upward like a stain. It looked like dried blood. I called her name aloud, not as an invocation, but as a plea. The sound fell flat against the walls. That evening I lit every candle I could find and sat in the library, determined not to look toward the ceiling. But as the hours passed, I began to hear it again, that same slow pacing above, sometimes near, sometimes distant, as though whoever moved there was circling something. I tried to write, but my hand trembled too much. Instead, I read from my father's journal, found among the dust-coated shelves. Most of it was mundane, records of tenants, harvests, expenses. But near the end, the handwriting faltered. The ink thinned, the words broke apart. The final entry read, "She refuses the ground. I have done what I must. May God forgive the inheritance I have given him." The ink trailed off into a smear, as though the pen had been snatched away mid-stroke. I closed the book and sat motionless, the air cold against my throat. The words echoed through me, heavier than prayer, heavier than guilt. I knew then what he had meant, and why she whispered from above. My mother had never left Bellmere House. I could not sleep after that night. Even when exhaustion hollowed out my thoughts, I dared not close my eyes. The house had begun to speak in ways it never had before. The sigh of floorboards, the rhythmic creak of an unseen hinge, the faint echo of breathing that did not belong to me. It was as though the walls had grown lungs, and they drew breath only when I wasn't listening. The morning came pale and bruised, light filtering through the curtains like smoke. I walked the corridors slowly, tracing the edges of old portraits with my fingers. Every face looked toward me, painted eyes sharpened by dust and grief. My father's likeness hung at the top of the stair, stern, severe, one hand resting on a Bible, the other on the arm of my mother. His expression had always troubled me, but now I saw something I had not before. A hint of fear beneath the pride, a tremor in the painted jaw. I moved through the rooms like a trespasser in my own house. The air was colder in the east wing, where no one had stepped for decades. The door to my mother's bedchamber had been locked since her passing, or so I thought. Yet when I reached it, the key was already turned, the latch undone. Inside, the curtains were still drawn. The scent of lavender clung faintly to the air, ghostly and wrong, like perfume left too long in the bottle. The bed was neatly made, but the indentation of a body remained on the sheets, not fresh, but recent enough that I could see the faint outline of where a hand might have rested beside the pillow. I stood there for a long time, afraid to breathe. On the vanity sat her hairbrush, a single strand of black hair wound between the bristles. My mother's hair had gone grey long before she died. Beneath the mirror, tucked into a drawer, I found something else, a folded letter addressed to no one. The paper was brittle, stained at the edges. The handwriting was hers. "He believes the house belongs to him," it read. "But I was here before him, and I shall be here when he is gone. The ground rejects me. The house remembers." The ink had run down the page as though written with tears instead of water. I carried the letter to the library and placed it beside my father's journal. Between the two, an image began to form, of love turned to cruelty, of death turned to possession. I began to suspect that what haunted Bellmere House was not a curse but an inheritance of conscience, a sin that refused burial. That night, I went to the attic. The ladder creaked beneath my weight, and every rung felt colder than the last. At the top, the air grew heavy with dust and the faint smell of mildew and iron. The moonlight seeped through cracks in the roof, casting thin silver lines across the floor. In the corner stood an old wooden trunk, one I remembered from childhood, the one she used to keep her wedding dress in. I hesitated before opening it. The latch was rusted, but it gave way with a soft groan. Inside, the fabric lay folded, yellowed with time. But beneath it was something else, the glint of glass and the faint shimmer of preserved skin. There were jars sealed with wax, filled with liquid the color of weak tea. Inside each one, small bones and fragments of something pale. At first I thought them to be animals, but the shape of one was unmistakably human. A tiny ribcage, a hand no larger than a sparrow's. My throat closed. My knees weakened. The light trembled. I do not remember how long I stood there. I only remember the sound of something shifting behind me, soft steps across the wooden floor. When I turned, the space was empty, yet the dust moved as though stirred by breath. For the first time I understood why my father's last words had begged forgiveness, and I knew that whatever he had done in the name of salvation was not for God but for concealment. My mother had not only died in that house, she had given birth to something that was never allowed to live, and Bellmere House had kept it. The following days unfolded like a fevered sermon. I could no longer tell where memory ended and dream began. Each corridor of Bellmere House seemed to lengthen when I turned away, each door leading to a room I did not recall building. The letter and the jars haunted me, not for what they revealed, but for what they implied. Something had been hidden beneath the language of mourning, beneath the prayers and black veils, something that was not meant to be known by the living. I began to read through my father's old ledgers, the ones he had kept locked in the small writing desk by the chapel window. His handwriting was firm, controlled, the script of a man who believed in order. Yet between the sermons and accounts of parish expenses were notations written in a trembling hand. The child's weight, 3 pounds 6 ounces. Baptism denied. Returned to the mother's care. Then, one final entry. Buried without rites. The date was 3 months before my mother's death. That evening, I walked to the chapel behind the house. The path was slick with rain and the yew trees leaned inward, as if to listen. The chapel door hung crooked on its hinges, and the pews were covered in mold and dust. The crucifix above the altar had split down the middle, the face of Christ broken, one eye dark with rot. I knelt before it out of habit, but my prayer faltered before it found form. My voice sounded strange in that hollow space, echoing against stone and decay. I asked for understanding, but what came instead was a whisper, not in words but in the shiver of air that passed behind me. I turned, expecting emptiness, but saw a figure seated in the front pew. A woman draped in black, her veil glimmering faintly in the candlelight. I called out, but she did not move. My legs betrayed me as I approached. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and on one finger was my mother's wedding ring. Yet when I reached out, the pew was empty, only a faint depression in the dust where her body should have been. I stumbled backward, striking my shoulder against the wall. From behind the altar came a faint sound. Not a whisper, not a voice, but something softer, wet and rhythmic. I moved the cloth aside and saw a small door in the stone. It was sealed with wax, just as the jars in the attic had been. The seal bore the mark of my father's parish. I hesitated, but the urge to know overcame fear. I pried it open. The smell that rose was unbearable, like spoiled milk and damp earth. Inside, wrapped in linen, was a small coffin no larger than a loaf of bread. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. The linen fell away to reveal bone, fragile and dry, yet not entirely human. The proportions were wrong. The skull was narrow, the jaw twisted as if mid-scream. A deformity, perhaps, or something that had not been allowed to finish becoming what it was meant to be. I dropped to my knees, unable to breathe. For years my father's sermons had condemned sin in all forms, yet here lay the proof that he had harbored one in his own house, that he had buried it beneath his chapel. The storm outside grew heavier. The windows trembled with wind. I placed the bones back into the coffin and shut the door. But as I sealed it again, I heard something, a faint sound, like the inhalation of breath from within the stone itself. That night, I dreamed of my mother standing in the doorway of my room, her face half shrouded, her arms empty. She said nothing. But when I woke, the scent of lavender filled the air once more, and I knew she had been there, or that something wearing her memory had come in her place. I could no longer leave Bellmere House. Each attempt felt as though the land itself resisted me. The path turned back. The fog thickened. The gate refused to open. I was being kept just as the bones were, and deep inside me, I began to understand the truth my father had written, but never spoken. The dead do not stay buried when guilt is the soil that covers them. I spent the next day in silence, pacing the ruined corridors of Bellmere House. Every portrait seemed to watch me, every mirror a shallow pool that threatened to swallow reflection. I had not eaten nor slept. The rain had turned the gardens into a mire, and the fog clung to the windows like breath from an unseen mouth. I told myself I would leave by dawn, yet dawn never came as it should. The sky remained bruised and low, and the clock in the foyer ticked without advancing a single minute. I was trapped in the same hour, reliving the same breath. It was as though the house had turned inward, folding itself around the secret beneath its chapel. By afternoon I returned to that place again. I brought with me a lantern, a small trowel, and my father's Bible. The door I had sealed the night before was cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. The wax had hardened again, though I had left it open. I pressed my fingers to the seal. Beneath it faintly something pulsed. I whispered aloud, not to summon but to confess. I spoke of the night my mother died, how father had locked himself in the chapel, how the servants had been dismissed, how the doctor's carriage never arrived. My voice trembled with each recollection, until I realized I was no longer speaking alone. The echo of my words came back distorted, thinner, as though repeated by a child learning to mimic speech. She died, it said. I held the lantern close, and the flame wavered though there was no wind. The air grew heavy, dense, full of the smell of iron. Then I saw it, faint moisture seeping from the stone around the sealed door. It was not water. It was the color of milk gone sour. I stepped back, but the wax split with a quiet pop, and the door began to open of its own accord. The chamber beyond was small, no larger than a cellar crypt. The walls were covered with symbols carved into the mortar, crosses turned upside down, circles filled with script I could not read. In the center, upon a slab of slate, lay another coffin, this one made of dark wood, its lid bound with rosary beads and wire. I lifted the lantern higher. A child's doll sat at its foot, its porcelain face cracked and painted eyes half erased by time. On the doll's dress was stitched a name, Clara, my mother's name before marriage. The realization struck with the weight of thunder. This was no grave of an unknown. It was a covenant sealed by blood and silence, a place where my father had buried not one sin but two. The lid of the coffin creaked as I reached toward it. My hand hovered, trembling, and then the voice came again from the hollow darkness before me, clear, soft, unmistakable. "Do not open it," it said. I turned, but there was no one. Only the faint flicker of the candlelight on the chapel's altar, and the figure of a woman reflected faintly in the broken glass of a window. She was veiled as before, her hand resting gently over her heart. I whispered, "Mother." The reflection nodded once, then raised a single finger to her lips as if to silence me. Her shape blurred, and for an instant I saw what lay beneath the veil. Not a face, but a hollow of ash and bone, as though memory itself had rotted away. The lantern faltered. The shadows swelled across the floor, filling the cracks between the stones. I stumbled backward and fell. The flames snuffed out in the damp air. Yet even in darkness I saw her, standing above the coffin, her veil shifting like smoke, her voice no longer gentle but pleading, "Do not let him out." And in that moment, I understood that what my father had buried was not a child at all. It was himself. When I awoke, the lantern lay cold beside me, and the air in the chapel was still, unnaturally so. The wax from the door's seal had reformed, thick and smooth as though it had never been broken. But my hand still bore the stains of that pale substance, and beneath my fingernails the faintest traces of dried blood. For a long while I did not move. I listened, expecting the sound of breath or whisper from the other side of the door. Nothing. Only the steady hum of silence, so deep it began to ring in my ears like a low choir. My father's face rose in memory then, stern, devout and unflinchingly calm even in death. I remembered his sermons on inheritance, on the rot passed from father to son, sin to sin, name to name. He had once said, "We do not own what God gives us, yea, we borrow it until our hands tremble too much to hold." But his hands had not trembled. They had built this tomb, sealed this chapel, and buried something that should not have borne our name. I returned to the east wing, where his study remained untouched. Dust lay thick over everything, the desk, the maps of the estate, the great family Bible with its cracked spine. I turned through its pages and found pressed between them a letter written in his own hand. "To my son Edward," it began, "should you ever open what I have sealed, know that you have undone the mercy of 40 years. The name of Bellmere must end with you. Do not try to free me. I am already freed. What remains in that chamber is not I, but the shadow of what faith could not save." I read those lines again and again, until the ink began to blur. He spoke of himself as though he had been both jailer and prisoner, as though his own spirit had been bound beneath the chapel. But how could that be? His grave lay in the parish yard. I had seen the coffin lowered myself. Still a terrible suspicion began to grow. I lit the hearth and waited for the flames to settle. Then, one by one, I burned every letter he had ever written. Sermons, ledgers, private notes, all but that single confession. The fire hissed and coughed as if it resisted the act, releasing a smell I can only describe as old breath. That night, I dreamt of the coffin again, not as I had seen it, but standing upright like a man waiting to be recognized. From the cracks in its wood, pale fingers pushed outward, and a voice, not his but mine, whispered, "Finish what he began." I awoke drenched in sweat, the bedsheets clinging like wet cloth to my skin. The moonlight fell across the room in a narrow band, illuminating the corner where the doll had appeared days before. She was there again, sitting upright, her glass eyes fixed upon me. In her porcelain hands was a folded page, torn, I realized, from the Bible in my father's study. On it was a single line written in his unmistakable script: "Every son must bury his own father." The fire in the hearth sputtered, though I had not lit it since dusk. Beneath the floorboards something shifted, a slow, dragging weight that moved from the chapel toward my room. It came to rest beneath me, silent at first, then tapping, once, twice, then a pause. I counted each sound until I realized what it was spelling. A word. Edward. I did not move. I did not breathe. For the first time since my mother's death, I prayed, were not for salvation but for ignorance, because if the dead can learn to speak, then perhaps they never died at all. And if my father's shadow was what lingered beneath Bellmere House, then what, God help me, had been buried in his coffin? I did not sleep again after that night. The hours dragged by in a dull, endless murmur, the kind of time that folds over itself until morning and night are one. I sat by the hearth, wrapped in my father's old coat, staring at the floorboards, as though they were the last barrier between me and him. The tapping had stopped, but its echo lingered. I could feel it in my teeth, like a pulse misaligned with my own. By dawn I had made my decision. There was no more hiding from what waited below. The chapel key still hung on the rusted ring by the study door, the one my father had forbidden me to touch. My hand shook as I took it, and for a moment I thought I felt it twitch like something alive. The morning light was pale and sour, casting the manor in its truest form, a ruin. The wallpaper peeled like old skin, the portraits had faded to shadows, and even the clocks refused to chime. I stepped into the corridor and heard the wind breathing through the broken panes. The house felt hollowed, emptied of every sound except my own steps. The chapel door resisted me at first, its hinges swollen with years of damp. When it finally gave way, the air that escaped was heavy, thick with mold and something else, something faintly sweet, like the scent of flowers placed on a grave too long ago. The candles I lit sputtered weakly, their flames trembling as though they knew the truth of where they burned. At the altar, the flagstone was different, newer than the rest, smoother, unmarked by time. I knelt and ran my fingers along its edge, tracing the faintest indentation, a seam no wider than a thread. When I pressed down, the stone groaned and shifted. Beneath it, darkness opened like a mouth. A stairway descended into the earth, narrow and spiraling. The air that rose from it was colder than winter, wet and close like breathing through cloth. I took the lantern, though I could scarcely keep it from shaking, and stepped down. The walls were lined with scripture, carved into the stone, verses twisted and incomplete, fragments of faith that no longer belonged to any living tongue. I passed phrases I half recognized. Dust shall, and the Father will not hear. His silence will be the mark. Each line sank deeper into my chest, as though I had once known them by heart. At the bottom of the stairs, the chamber opened wide, circular, low-ceilinged, lit by the last guttering remains of candles that could not have burned for decades. Their wax had pooled and hardened into grotesque shapes, like faces melting into one another. And in the center, upright against the far wall, stood the coffin. It was indeed my father's. I would have known that wood anywhere, the grain of it, the scent of oak and myrrh. But it was unsealed, the lid pried half open. Inside there was no body, only a tattered black cassock, folded neatly, and beneath it a mirror. I bent closer, the lantern trembling in my hand. The mirror's surface was blackened, but faintly, very faintly, it began to reflect. My own face appeared first, gaunt and pale. Then behind it a second figure, taller still and unmistakably wearing my father's coat. I turned, but the chamber was empty. The reflection did not move as I did. It watched, patient, waiting for recognition. The voice that came next was not from the air around me. It was from within my chest, as though memory itself had found a tongue. You have worn my sins well. Edward! The lantern slipped from my hand and shattered, the flame dying instantly. Darkness swallowed me whole. I groped blindly toward the stairs, but the path was gone. Only the coffin remained, its lid now fully closed. I reached for it, desperate, my nails scraping against the wood, and felt warmth pulsing beneath it, slow and steady, like the beat of a buried heart. When I pulled my hand away, the skin of my palm bore a mark, a perfect circle, raw and red. It burned even now as I write this by candlelight. The sound has returned too, the tapping beneath the floors, the slow whisper from the walls. But tonight it is different. It does not call my name anymore. It says, "Come down," and I fear I will. I have not left this room in 3 days. The door swells against its hinges from the damp, and I have not the strength to force it. The rain has not ceased. Each drop feels like a clock marking the seconds left to me. My hand shakes too much to write, yet I must. The ink bleeds into the paper, but perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps all confessions must dissolve before they are finished. The house no longer feels empty. There are movements now, soft, deliberate, measured. The floorboards sigh beneath unseen weight, and the walls expand as if inhaling. Once I thought it was the sound of the sea wind through the cracks, but now I know better. The air is too still for that. The noise is not outside. It lives within these walls, as if the manor itself has begun to breathe again. I see my father's silhouette in the glass sometimes, though no one stands behind me. It's clearest at dusk, when the last light fades and the house decides to remember. He does not accuse me. He merely stands, silent, waiting. I understand now what he meant by inheritance. It was never the estate, nor the ledger, nor the name Bellmere. It was this burden, this rot that passes from father to son like a blood oath whispered in the dark. I tried to destroy the place last night. I poured lamp oil along the hall, struck the match, but it would not catch. The flame died in my hand, as though smothered by a breath I could not see. The walls drank the oil, and the air filled with a scent like earth turned over in a grave. There is no escape from something that has already claimed the soil beneath your feet. This morning, I woke to find the mirror from the cellar propped against my bed. I did not bring it up. Its surface was no longer blackened, it was clear, alive. When I looked, I did not see myself. I saw the chapel, the open coffin, the staircase, and a figure walking toward it, wearing my coat, my face. He knelt before the coffin, and for the first time I understood the true shape of my inheritance. It was not the manner, not even my father's sin. It was continuation. The house does not remember who built it, only who remains to keep it breathing. The tapping began again at noon. Slow at first, measured. Then it quickened as though impatient. Beneath the boards of the study, the same place I first heard it. I followed the sound, each step sinking deeper into the rhythm until it matched my heartbeat. I pressed my ear to the floor and heard not one tapping, but two, one above, one below, the echo of myself calling back. I do not know how long I stayed there. When I rose, my knees were stained dark, as though I had knelt in water or blood. The room smelled of my father's cassock, of wax, of decay. The candlelight flickered once, twice, and then steadied. He was there, or something that remembered being him. Standing in the corner, calm, familiar. The same eyes, the same trembling mouth. He did not move toward me. He only raised his hand, and I saw the same circular scar that now marks my own palm. "It is done," I whispered. "I understand." He nodded once. Then the light dimmed, and I was alone. Yet the silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of every voice that had ever called this place home. The manor exhaled long and deep, and I felt the floor settle. I have sealed the cellar again. The key rests beside this journal. Whoever finds it must understand. The house is never vacant. It only waits. If there is mercy in this world, the sea will take it soon. The walls already sweat with salt, and the foundations moan with the tide. I can feel the pull beneath me, as if the house itself longs to return to the earth that birthed it. My candle burns low now. The wax trembles like breath. I can hear the tapping again, closer this time, no longer beneath the floor. It comes from the walls, from behind me. If these pages survive, let them stand as my confession. I was not cursed nor chosen. I was simply next. The widow of Bellmere still walks the upper hall. Her footsteps echo above my bed, and though I never saw her face, I know it now. For when I close my eyes, I see my mother's hands folded over the coffin lid, and the name carved beneath it, Edward Bellmere. The candle gutters. The ink fades. The house listens, and then nothing.